All right, welcome, WHAP students. This is actually chapter 19, States and Societies of Sub-Saharan Africa. It's pretty straightforward, actually. Not a whole lot of names that you have to remember. It's kind of more big ideas, really talking about migrational patterns and things. But you need to know the Bantu. Bantu-speaking peoples are going to end up settling south of the equator. The equator runs really kind of through the middle of the continent of Africa. And what's important about the Bantu is they're going to spread that agricultural revolution with them. And types of herding is also going to spread with the Bantu migrations. They're going to take their knowledge of iron metallurgy with them to the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa. So they're immensely important. They're a language group, so there'll be many different tribes that branch off of the Bantu-speaking language group, kind of like Indo-European is a language group. They cultivate bananas, which is going to be very important. Bananas were originally domesticated in Southeast Asia, but Mali sailors were going to end up colonizing the rather large island of Madagascar between 300 and 500. And they're going to introduce bananas, yams, and chickens to the continent of Africa. Well, those are three very important food sources that are really going to help the food supply, which is going to increase the population in Africa, of course. And as you can see, their population is going to steadily climb. And sort of like Europe here, you'll see their population, especially for as enormous as the continent of Africa is very sparse compared to what is going on in Asia. Now, the Africans lived in kin-based societies, similar to what you would think of with Native Americans in America. Stateless. There's no it's not like France. It's not like England or anything like that. And there's no state government. These were very segmented societies living just really in groups of people that are loosely related to each other. There were no elaborate hierarchies, nothing like India and the caste system. There were no bureaucracies because the populations of these places were small. The average population of village was only about 100 people. So you can imagine that's fairly easy to keep under control. And it was ruled by the elders, the most respected men. The network of villages, a network of villages resolved disputes in an ad hoc manner, meaning as necessary. If some weird thing showed up, they would get together and they would solve it. But it's just easier to manage these very small groups of people. Higher government authorities were rare because, quite simply, you just didn't need them. There was no need for a big government when you have 100 people or 200 people in the village. Now, eventually, after the population begins to climb, you get population pressures after 1000 CE, which would increase competition, it would increase disputes, and you start seeing the emergence of these really small chiefdoms, which would begin overruling kin-based groups. And now you start having, this area ruled by a chief, and eventually it gets even a little bit bigger, and you get small kingdoms. So you get a king, and you like Ife and Benin will be some of the areas that emerge. So here you can see kingdoms, empires, and city-states of sub-Saharan Africa from 800 to 1500. You get the Kingdom of Ghana here. You get what becomes an actual empire. Remember, this is fairly good size. Look at Spain. I mean, this is a good-sized area here with Mali. You get the Songhai Empire, which is inside of that as well. All right, first up is the Kingdom of Congo, which originated in the basin of the Congo River. It was a conglomeration of several village alliances, meaning that they kind of grouped together. They participated actively in kind of these new trade networks, most centralized rule of the early Bantu kingdoms. Their currency was actually cowrie shells, was what they used as currency. They ruled from the 14th to 17th century, so about 300 years, until they were undermined by Portuguese slave traders who are going to come in and they're going to begin working this relationship where West African leaders will help them kidnap other members of African tribes for slavery in the New World. Now, Islam will spread to West Africa, and it did so through these trans-Saharan caravans. So if we go back to our map, you've got these trans-Saharan trade networks from the Middle East, from Islam. These are all Muslim areas through here. And they're going to spread across the enormous Sahara Desert, and they're going to bring Islam with them to sub-Saharan Africa. Very important. profound influence after the 8th century. The vast majority of Africans are going to be converted to Islam. Dissection of the Sahara begins, or desiccation, sorry, of the Sahara began about 5000 BC. All that means is that once upon a time, the Sahara was like a lush waterland, and then the environment changed and it becomes the largest desert in the world. But the introduction of Arabian camels revolutionized trade. These camels were well suited to cross the Sahara Desert. So it would take 70 to 90 days to cross the Sahara Desert in these camel caravans. And Arabs would end up establishing trading communities such as ones at Gal. We get the emergence of the Kingdom of Ghana, developed in the 4th to 5th century CE as protection against camel driving raiders, which did happen. A lot of gold in Africa. And so Ghana became the center of the African gold trade. They sold ivory and slaves as well, and they become part of what Europeans will call like the Gold Coast. Kumbisali, it's the capital of the Kingdom of Ghana, and it was their principal trading center. And at its high point, it has a population of 15,000 to 20,000. So comparative to the Chinese and the Indians, I mean, Africa is not quite as developed. You're never going to see the large cities like you see in Asia. Even in this time period, even Europe is beginning to develop bigger cities than what Africa has. All right, but Kumbi is the military and cultural center of Africa. The kings of Ghana would convert to Islam in the 10th century, so the 900s, and why did they do it? Well, because it's easier for them to trade with the Muslims if they share the same religion. Now, they are going to put a twist on Islam that doesn't always sit that well with some of the traveling Sufis and Islamic, the Qadis, the Islamic judges and stuff who would travel around. But that's okay. They still do have this Muslim relationship. Here's one name for you to remember: Sundiata, who reigned for about 25 years in the Empire of Mali, which would basically encompass Ghana and more. Took greater advantage of the trans-Saharan trade. Sundiata did, the Lion King, basically. They were nominally Muslim, but they don't force conversions on their people. So the leaders and the traders are Muslims, but they're not going to force their people to convert to Islam. And our star of the show really is Mansa Musa, whose reign you can see there from 1312 to 1337. He's the grandnephew of Sundiata, so he's got a nice lineage there. He, however, is a very devout Muslim. And because of that, he will perform his Hajj, his migration to Mecca. And he does it in 1324 to 25. And along the way, he's going to build all these different mosques, these Muslim churches. He's going to support Muslim scholars with his immense amount of money. And of course, he's passing out gold right and left. He goes through cities and passes out gold to help the poor and stuff. And it really drives up prices. The inflation in the areas that he visit, he messes it up for almost 100 years, I think. The Mali Empire would end up declining after Mansa Musa's rule. And here you can see a chart of his camel caravans. There's Mansa Musa there, West African king, perhaps the richest man in history. Now, the Indian Ocean trade is enormously important. The East Coast. Now we're switching from the West. The first part of that was talking really about the Horn, the western portion of Africa. Now we're going to go over to the East. The East Coast maritime trade was weak until the 2nd century. And then the Bantu peoples began populating the coast. Now, Swahili, meaning coasters, began engaging in trade with the Arabs. You got to think of your geography here. Let's go back real quick. It's important to have it down. So here are the coasters. The Swahili-speaking peoples will be in this area. And all this is the Indian Ocean trade. India is going to be right out here. Spice Islands are going to be right out here. And it's going to become part of the Indian Ocean Trade Network, it brings a lot of wealth to Africa, to the area, especially in the East. All right, the Swahili began developing city-states, great wealth in the 11th and 12th centuries. Architecture moved from wood and mud to a little bit more elaborate coral and stone architecture. They are importing Chinese silk and porcelain, these luxury items. Indian Ocean trade, very important. Um, Knock is one of the city states here on the east coast. Here's some of their sculptures, and Africa has some pretty neat sculptures in their history. Kilwa, another city state on the East African coast, based off of fishing, did have some limited trade. They would eventually turn to agriculture and increase their trade in pottery and stoneware. And by the 14th century, it had become a major trading center that was exporting over a ton of gold per year by the 15th century CE. Africa is a continent with enormous amounts of resources, and they have gold, and they have diamonds, they have some really valuable items. Zimbabwe, the word meaning dwelling of the chief. There's a pretty cool stone complex called the Great Zimbabwe. We'll try to look at some pictures of that. Built in the early 13th century, that held about 18,000 people by the late 15th century. And Zimbabwe was a city that managed to trade between the internal and coastal regions. You have these trade networks crisscrossing Africa. Now, Islam in East Africa. Ruling elites in East Africa accepted Islam without, again, forcing general population to convert. They often retained their pagan religious traditions and practices, and Islam served as the social glue with other merchants and states. It's something that kind of they all have in common. Remember that Africa is a pretty divided area, lots of small groups that see themselves as being very different from each other. Now, some kingdoms, empires, and city-states developed well-defined classes where you'd have ruling elites, and then your middle class would be your merchants, and then the lower class were your peasants, your commoners. Pretty standard fare there. Other areas in sub-Saharan Africa continued to use the traditional kin-based groups. So where you had big trading centers, you saw chiefdoms and kingdoms and even empires emerge. But in other low population areas, you're going to stick with the kin-based system. And the kinship groups were basically extended families, which would develop into essentially clans. So, it's mom, dad, and the brothers and sisters, the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents, the cousins, extended families and clans. The idea of private property is less prevalent in these groups. Again, they're like Native Americans. Everything is held communally. We share it. Everybody, you just take what you need from it. You don't have to lord it over it and consider it just yours and no one else's. Harvests were actually distributed by the elders to the families in a manner that worked for everybody. There were definitely sex and gender relations. Men began to work with specialized skills. They were tanning hide and leather, working on iron. They typically did the heavy labor. But both sexes, men and women, did work in agriculture. The male rule was more common, but there were some expanded roles for women in Africa. There were women merchants, and there were even some women who served in the military. And you had a couple of female rulers as well. But Islamic norms began to slowly penetrate African society, and of course that will bring a little more conservatism to women's roles. Age grades was important. Basically, you had peer groups. You would, if you were, it'd be like in today's time, it'd be like 9th and 10th graders were responsible for doing this, and juniors and seniors had to do this, which was, they're a little more freedom. Middle school kids, that maybe the only thing they're trusted with is bringing water up from the river. You've got jobs and responsibilities that associate with your age group. Slavery had been practiced since ancient times, but as we've mentioned, slaves typically were captives of war. They were POWs, prisoners of war, or they were people who owed money, or the possible suspected witch could become a slave. And if you're a daggum criminal, well, that could land you in slavery as well. Slaves typically were used in agricultural labor, and slaves began over time they began to be seen as a form of personal wealth and social status. The more slaves you had, the more wealthy you were. Increased trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trade stimulated the slave trade by the 9th century CE. So the Muslims are really going to up the slave trading, and eventually when the Portuguese and Spanish began needing a labor source for the New World, they're going to take over the slave trade and blow it out of proportion. Africa replaces Eastern Europe as the principal source of slaves. Eastern Europe, the Balkans, Slavs, these type of people, they were the area for slaves for a long time, but now it has shifted to Africa. There's an internal African slave trade which is created, and basically the more powerful African states would attack smaller kinship-based groups, so they didn't have any protection, these little small areas, and they're exporting 10,000 to 20,000 slaves per year. Here's a picture. Slave traders. That should tell you something. That's an actual picture. So slavery, some would argue, still exists today. The Zanj Revolt, it's worthwhile knowing. You had some slaves from the Swahili coast were exported to work in Mesopotamia. So they go to the Middle East. They work on sugarcane plantations, which sucks, and in salt mines, which sucks really, really bad. And then in 869, a slave named Ali bin Muhammad, so as you can see, he is a Muslim slave from Africa, mounts a revolt of some 15,000 slaves, even captures the city of Basra. Eventually, they would be crushed by the Abbasids in extremely brutal fashion. But for a decade or so, the Zanj revolt was successful. African religion had great diversity, but the one common element was of a single male creator god. So it is a fairly monotheistic idea, but they did have lesser deities that were associated with natural phenomena. So sort of like Native Americans there. They also had ancestor worship, much like the Chinese did. They had people whose jobs were as diviners. The religious specialists were typically men. They would read oracles and commit spells and other rituals. There's definitely a strong feel of witchcraft in African society. Limited emphasis on theology. They're not writing stuff down. It's nothing like the Holy Bible or the Quran or anything like that. And morality and the balance of nature was very important. Basically, being a good person. Early Christianity does show up in North Africa. In the first century, Christianity was actually fairly popular in Egypt, and initially very weak in sub-Saharan Africa. You did have the Christian kingdom of Axum in the 300s. Ethiopia also welcomes Christians. First, it's the merchants who are going to be converted to Christianity, and then kings would actually convert after that. The Bible gets translated into the Ethiopian language, and that's very important to convert many Africans. Places in Axum in Ethiopia is very isolated during the time period when Islam is very prevalent in Africa, and they would carve out these massive churches, carve them out of solid rock. Here's a broken obelisk, like the Washington D.C. monument. That's an obelisk, and this one has fallen over and broken here at Axum. Again, isolation from other Christian areas until the 1500s, and you got the Portuguese and the Spanish showing up, so that will help pull them out of isolation. So they have independent development, and so their Christianity is going to have a much different feel than the Christianity in other areas of the world. The idea of a spirit world, and they use magical amulets and stuff like that, stuff you wouldn't see in other Christian areas. All right, well, that's it. I mean, there is some things you need to break down there. Songhai, the Empire of Mali. You need to know that Bantu were the ones who really kind of started to show, spreading throughout sub-Saharan Africa, taking with them agriculture, their language, and the use of iron. Very important there. You need to know the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, its importance, and how it's going to import Islam into Africa. You should know Sundiata. You should know Mansa Musa for sure. And you should know the Swahili are situated on the eastern coast, and that the introduction of bananas and yams are going to up the population, which is going to lead to the emergence of chiefdoms and kingdoms, and that Axum is a Christian place. that is independent for most of its time, and that no matter what your religion, there's going to be an African twist or an African spin on it. Okay, guys, that's it. Hopefully that doesn't take too long, and we'll see you in class.